When the Brandon Ingram trade was first announced, I really didn't know how to feel about it, but now that I've had a little bit of time to think it over more, I'm starting to really love this trade, and I'm going to explain why in this video. So the first concern that people have right now is that the Raptors made this trade and Brandon Ingram is a free agent this summer. He may just walk in free agency, and if that's the case, we gave up these assets for absolutely nothing. But from all the reports I've heard, it seems like Ingram wants to be in Toronto and he wants to help them get to that next level. At the deadline, the only two teams that seemed to be interested in Ingram were the Raptors, of course, and then the Atlanta Hawks. And the fact that the Raptors were able to trade for Ingram will just show him that they actually are interested in his skill set and they actually want to invest in him long term. And I think that will be enough to get him to re-sign with the team. Even though I believe that Ingram will want to re-sign with Toronto, there's still the question of how much money they should give him. So with that being said, we have to factor in a few numbers. Right now, the Raptors have $137 million guaranteed for next season, and the luxury tax is projected at $187 million. This means that the Raptors will have about $50 million to work with in the summer, but you have to factor in that they have a first-round draft pick that they have to sign to a contract. They also have a second-round pick as well, so by the time they sign those two guys, and then maybe fill out the roster with some minimum contracts just to get the amount of guys you actually need on a team, they're probably going to have about $37 million to spend on Brandon Ingram. The thing is, the Raptors don't really have much competition when it comes to signing Brandon Ingram. There are some teams who are projected to have a lot of salary cap space in the offseason, but those teams are not very good. A team like the Brooklyn Nets is projected to have the most salary cap space, and they're in the very early stages of a rebuild. They don't have a young all-star level player like Scottie Barnes, so it doesn't really make sense for them to go and try to sign Brandon Ingram, especially when you don't know how he's going to fit with your team. In the case of the Raptors, they'll at least have a little bit of time to see Ingram play with the team before re-signing him, and then on top of that, they have his bird rights, so all signs are pointing towards the Raptors being the favorite to re-sign Ingram, and I think Raptors fans should be pretty confident that he's going to re-sign with the team. Now, there are some concerns about Ingram's health and how maybe giving him a big contract is a bad idea because this is a guy who has some injury history. And I'm not going to act like I have absolutely zero concerns about that, but I think it's worth me offering some context on some of his injuries, and then you can go from there and see how you feel about the situation with that added information. So early in his career, Ingram was a little bit unlucky with his injuries. In his rookie year, he played 79 games, but then in his second and third years, that total dropped. In his second year, though, he did miss 7 games due to a concussion, which is kind of like a freak injury. You can't really control that. Then in his third season, he missed 4 games due to a suspension. I don't know if you remember the fight between Chris Paul and Rajon Rondo. Those guys are usually brought up in that fight and that beef, but Brandon Ingram was actually involved in that, and so he was suspended for some time because of that incident. But then the season concluded with him actually forming a blood clot, and so again, that's kind of something that he obviously couldn't control, and it caused him to miss the last 19 games of the year. So if you just looked at his game played total, you'd think that, oh, this is a guy who's really injury prone. But if you kind of look at the context of some of those injuries early on, you can kind of see that he was getting a bit unlucky. Then he went from LA to New Orleans, and in his first 2 years with the Pelicans, he played 62 and 61 games. But it's worth noting that those seasons were shortened due to the pandemic. Those seasons were only 72 games, so he was actually on pace to play 71 and 69 games in those seasons, which is pretty good. In the past 4 seasons, though, is when those injury concerns start to become a little bit more legitimate. He's had recurring lower body injuries. With his ankle, he had a toe injury that kept him out for about 27 games a few years ago. And the most games he's played in the past 4 years was 64 games last season, which it's okay, but it's not something great if you want to give a guy a big contract. Even still, I think there's 2 things that are really worth noting. The first being that when Ingram has played over the past few years, his play hasn't dropped off. Even though he's had some availability issues, he's had some recurring injuries, when he's playing on the floor, he is a guy who can still score the ball really well from all 3 levels. He's a really good passer at the forward position. And so it's not one of those situations where you have a guy that's getting injured and you see his play dropping off as he continues to have injury after injury. And then secondly, I feel like we need to be a little bit more forgiving with guys when they do have injuries. I think a perfect example is this trade deadline. We saw 2 guys, and Anthony Davis and Zach LaVine, get traded, who in the past few years have had injury concerns. Anthony Davis is someone who was always being ridiculed in recent years because, yeah, his availability wasn't great. He had a 3-year stretch where he was only playing about half of the Lakers' games, and yeah, that obviously causes concern for people if you're looking to invest in a guy like that. But I think people forget that last year Anthony Davis played in 76 games for the Lakers, and then this season, before he got traded, he only missed a few games. And then in the case of Zach LaVine, this is a guy who tore his ACL early in his career, and then last season he only played 25 games because he had to get foot surgery. His stats were down, he wasn't really playing too well when he actually was in the lineup, and those health concerns played a part in why people were looking down on Zach LaVine as a player. But similar to Anthony Davis, he bounced back. He was putting up really good numbers this year with the Bulls. He was playing in most of their games. He only missed a few games before he was actually traded. So I think the point I'm trying to make is just that we have to give guys an opportunity to at least redeem themselves when it comes to that label of being an injury-prone player. Obviously, injuries are not something that you can just completely ignore, but the Raptors paid a pretty low price for Ingram, and look, yes, he's had some injuries in the past, he's had some injury concerns, but as I've said, there's guys who have been in similar situations and been able to bounce back and get back to playing healthy basketball, playing a majority of the games again, so it's worth taking the chance on Ingram at that price. So I've talked about the prospects of re-signing Ingram, I've talked about his injury history. Now it's time to talk about his actual fit with the team, because that's another concern that people have, but I'm actually starting to feel a bit more optimistic about his fit with the team. The problems people have with Ingram mainly have to do with his three-point shooting. This is a guy who's had seasons where he's actually shown that he can be a high-volume, efficient three-point shooter, but then there's been other years where his volume has been lower than you'd like it to be. And if you're playing on a Raptors team who struggles to shoot the three, and that's one of their main issues on offense, having Brandon Ingram as your best player kind of just adds to that problem in a lot of people's eyes. And then on top of that, he's a guy who likes to have the ball in his hands, but he's not viewed as a guy that's talented enough to be that number one option on a really good playoff team or a team that even has contending championship aspirations. And so if you're going to give Ingram a big multi-year contract on top of already having quickly signed to a pretty big deal, RJ Barrett making a good amount of money, Scottie Barnes just getting his rookie extension, you're kind of locking yourself into this core for at least the near future. So I get why maybe you wouldn't have too much faith in quickly Barrett, Ingram, Barnes, and Pirtle being your starting five going forward, especially if you actually do have concerns about Ingram's health. In the Eastern Conference though, that starting lineup is probably good enough to make the playoffs. And some people might say that that's not a good thing because if you have a guy like Scottie Barnes, you want to be bad, you want to get a top pick. But not every team can afford to just tank and hope to get the number one pick, because if every team adopted that mentality, there would be a lot of teams being disappointed when they didn't get that first overall selection and add a young star to their roster. For many Raptors fans, the best part of last season was after the OG Anunoby trade before they moved on from Pascal Siakam. They were starting quickly Barrett, Barnes, Siakam, and Pirtle, and the team looked good. It was a small sample size, it was only 4 games of those guys actually starting together, but they went 3-1 against pretty good competition. They had wins against Cleveland, they won against the Grizzlies with Ja Morant, they lost to Sacramento, but then they beat Golden State. And just like the current roster, that Raptors team didn't have a whole lot of shooting, which would maybe concern a lot of people. But what they did have is skilled players at every position. Not every team can say that they have good passers at the 1 through 5 spots, and you look at the team now, Quickly can pass the ball, RJ Barrett's improved as a passer this year with more touches and more offensive responsibility. We all know what Scottie Barnes can do as a passer at his size, and then Pirtle is a really good passer for a center. And then Ingram is a skilled forward who can handle and pass the ball as well. And if you have those guys with a coach that is implementing ball movement and player movement like Darko has been, I think there's reason to believe that the offensive fit could be better than maybe people believe, because like I said last season, although it was a brief stint, when Siakam was playing with Quickly, Barrett, Barnes, and Pirtle, they were finding success and they were really fun to watch. I actually kind of wanted the Raptors to keep Siakam at that point. But you have Ingram now, who's a little bit younger. You're going to end up having him locked up for multiple years, and then you have a lot of young, talented guys coming off your bench as well. I think people are looking at the starting lineup and saying, oh my god, Toronto's going to be spending so much money on that starting five. but they forget that a lot of the players coming off their bench are still on rookie contracts, which aren't too expensive. You have guys like Jamal Shed, Grady Dick, Jacoby Walter, Ochai Agbaji, Jamison Battle, Jonathan Mobo, and then on top of that, there's a good chance they have a top 5 pick in this year's draft. So this team could actually have some pretty good depth next year. And when you combine that depth with the fact that the Raptors still own all of their first-round draft picks, you have to realize that this isn't the final move for the Raptors. They're not trading for Brandon Ingram and thinking that he's going to be Scottie Barnes' co-star and they're going to develop together and become a championship contender that way. That's not what I think this move is for the Raptors. I think this is just the first piece of the puzzle for them, or not first piece of the puzzle, but there's going to be more moves that are going to be made, I think. As we saw with this trade deadline, the NBA is just super unpredictable, especially now with the different tax implications with the second apron and all that. There are going to be a lot more stars and I think superstar level players that become available in recent years. And I think two guys that immediately catch my attention right now are Devin Booker and Anthony Edwards. These are two guys who are playing in the Western Conference, which is super loaded, and their teams are kind of struggling after finding success in recent years. The Suns made the finals a few years ago, then they kind of tried to go all in, trading for Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal, and we all know that their salary cap situation is just a disaster, so maybe Devin Booker becomes available in the coming years and the Raptors can trade for him. The same thing could be said for Anthony Edwards. The Timberwolves made the conference finals last year, then they decided to trade Cat as more of a financial move to get more flexibility in the future. But it's not a guarantee that with this financial flexibility going forward that they're actually able to build a contender around Anthony Edwards. So again, if they're one of those teams that's just barely getting into the playoffs as a 7 or 8 seed over the next few years, maybe he starts to get frustrated and wants out and Minnesota starts listening to offers for him. These are just hypothetical scenarios, obviously, but the point is that Toronto has the ability to make a trade for a star if they become available. They could trade RJ quickly, Grady Dick, Jacoby Walter, Agbaji, whatever player they draft in the lottery this season. They have all their picks going forward, as I mentioned, so Toronto's just going to have the option going forward to maybe get another star. Like I was talking about earlier, not every team can just hope to get the #1 pick and build their team that way, so the Raptors tried another method of acquiring talent, and they did so at a pretty low cost. And I think that it makes them better in the short term. Ingram's a very talented player. We've seen the blueprint of Quickly, Barrett, Barnes, Siakam, and Poeltl finding success together. I think if you plug Ingram in for Siakam, they can find success as well. So you can be good in the short term, give your fans something to cheer about, and you still have lots of assets going forward that you could use to make another move and just upgrade the roster and take them to a whole nother level. So this Ingram trade has been very polarizing, but hopefully I was able to convince any concerned Raptors fans out there why they should love this trade. Anyways, that's going to be all for today's video. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. With all that being said, I'm out, and I'll see you in the next video.